My guest today is Latoya Nelson, the founder of the Attuned Community School, a hybrid homeschool program in Warner Robins, Georgia. Latoya is an experienced educator with not one, but two master's degrees in education, one in special education and one in trauma-informed curriculum and instruction. She's also currently in the process of getting a doctorate in education. And Latoya was a public school teacher for over a decade, primarily working with middle school students, teaching social studies. She worked in both public schools and charter schools, and has been especially interested in working with children in foster care as well as adoptive families. She launched the Attuned Community School in August of 2022. Latoya Nelson, welcome to the Liberated Podcast.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you here. It's really excited to hear your founder story, but I'd love to start with what got you interested in education to begin with? Why did you decide to become a teacher so many years ago?
I think I always knew I wanted to be a teacher since I was a little girl. You have your dolls lined up, and you pretend to play school. It was kind of just always in me, but as I got older, I of course got interested in other things and my interest kind of swayed. But when I went back to college, I was like, no, I think I still want to be a teacher. And I didn't even major in education to begin with. I majored in sociology, but something in me just knew I wanted to teach. So even though I did some other things for a little while, I ended up getting back into education. I just kind of always was drawn to it. I love to learn. So I really like to pass that enthusiasm off to other people as well.
So I know you taught a variety of grade levels, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, through your more than 10 years teaching in public and charter schools. What was that experience like?
It It was interesting because you could kind of see the shift in education. Like when I first got into education, um, it was like, of course, I've got my blinders on. I'm super excited, ready to get started. But there was something I would say around like 2016, you could feel the climate of education really starting to shift. And we saw a lot of kids coming in just with a lot of stuff going on. There was no more leaving your troubles at the door and just come in and kind of put your learning hat on and forgetting everything. But a lot of people just didn't know how to navigate that. And so for me, I was just like, I could feel that kind of like transformative shift that was happening, but it was like everyone was fighting it. And so I just, in my head, I'm like, well, what can I do? And that's kind of when I decided, well, maybe I'll try and go back to school and learn it a little bit more. And that's when I got my first master's degree in special education, but that wasn't quite it either. It wasn't quite that children just had disabilities. And that's when I decided to pursue the second master's degree in trauma-informed education.
So, what did you see as a special education teacher? I know you started teaching social studies as a classroom teacher and then shifted to special education. I think it's really interesting that many of the founders that I interview on the podcast are former special education teachers. There must be something about special education that correlates with eventually becoming a founder. I'm curious if you have any theories on that or what that experience was shifting from social studies to special ed.
I think a lot of it had to do with as a general ed teacher, you kind of got everybody. Everybody's in the room. During that time, there definitely was a push for inclusion. And I want everyone to be included. I'm all, for inclusion, but I think there was this idea the least restrictive environment. That's what our law says. But in my head, I was like, I don't know that we need the least restrictive environment as much as we need the most supportive environment. What environment is a child going to thrive in? Because it's not a one size fits all. And as a general ed teacher, it was like, I kind of had to make one size fit all. I've got this one lesson, I've got 40 kids in a room. You've got some here, some there, some over here. And it's like, you've got to craft one thing that fits everybody. And I was like, this clearly is not working. So, what can I kind of like shift my mindset? I can't control everything, but I can control myself. So, how can I kind of shift gears to provide a more supportive space? And then I was like, well, maybe I'll move into like special education. And so that's kind of when I shifted into that field. And I was like, absolutely not sure that this was the right move or the right answer. Um, and like I said, there was a climate shift in education during that time, lots of politics, lots of things going on. And I was like, I don't know that every child that's coming into this program necessarily has a disability. And there's nothing
Mm.
wrong with having a disability, but I don't know that that's the response. And that's
Mm.
kind of when I shifted into that second master's degree. And I was like, I think there's something larger going on that's communal because there's way too many children that are experiencing this, but we're not kind of getting to the root cause of it all.
And what is that, or what do you speculate that
I mean,
bigger
I kind of
factor is?
speculated that our families were shifting. Um, and families have been shifting for quite some time, but I saw a lot of children being raised by siblings, being raised by grandparents, being raised by fictive kin. It could be
Mm.
an aunt that's not technically an aunt or a grandparent. I saw a lot of children. There's this idea that children, if their parents are not visual in the school, that they don't care. But that's not true. There's lots of families working
Yeah.
hourly wage jobs and they can't miss. So there was a lot of that happening. And our kids were kind of suffering, from those things because school was meant for school, right? You come to school, you sit down, you get your ABCs, your one, two, threes, and you're supposed to go home and go on about your business. But there was something transformative that need to happen in the school setting because now school was not just for ABCs and one, two, threes. People are trying to get their needs met. And even though we learn about that, in undergrad, they teach you about Maslow and all those other
Yeah.
things. I think when we're in that setting and with all those politics shifting, lots of high stakes testing and this and that, and you got
Mhm.
to stay on pace and you got to stay on track. There was just everyone's focused on that, but these children are like, my needs are not being met. And not just needs like in clothes or food or water, but my fundamental need for connection is not being met.
Mm. So you shifted to special education, and then got another master's degree. I guess, at what point did you start thinking, I need to go off and create my own solution? What sort of happened from kind of gathering those degrees to getting started on the path of being an entrepreneur?
I think there was like multiple things that happened at over the course of time. Like when my daughter started kindergarten, and I always say her story is her story to share, but my children come to me through adoption or kinship care, some people call it. And so I always knew that um, eventually we might need to look into alternative spaces for her because she never really thrived in a traditional setting. She was just kind of like, I mean, I was learning, so I'm like, well, this is where you go. You turn 5 years old, you go to school. That's just what you do. But we had issues forever from day one. We had issues, and so I was like, well, what's happening? That's kind of what pushed me to really get back into like special ed and the trauma informed. And then I started seeing it in my classroom as well. So I'm like, okay, it's not just my child who's going through this. There are other children clearly, because they're right here in front of me, that are dealing with this. And then I'm going years and years. I'm like, okay, I've got all this training, I've got all this knowledge and this background, I'm doing all these things, but at on pressing on my neck. And I had really great leaders in my schools. They were phenomenal, but they're like, you got to follow the pacing guide. You got to do this. And I'm like, my kids are crying for help. They're literally crying in
Mm,
multiple ways for help. But there's always, you got to get to the deadline. You got to make sure they're passing the test. You got to make sure you do this. And I just was like, this is not working. If I am feeling the pressure and feeling so overwhelmed, to the point where I'm coming home in tears, and dealing with things, and I can only imagine how you feel as a child that hasn't even been here that long. And that's kind of when I was like, I'm kind of at my wit's end. I'm not really being supported. And I did shift and move to Georgia from Maryland. And that's really when I was like, okay, this isn't going to work. I'm not even going to pretend that this is going to continue to work for me. I think it's time to get out of here.
mm. And so then what happened next? Because this must have been sort of around COVID time as well, leading
It
up
was
to
right
your
after
launch.
COVID. Yeah, it was
Okay.
really after COVID, kind of at that peak where everyone's like, the children are not the same. The children are not the same. And I'm like, yeah, but we're trying to do the same old things. And even though the children, we're saying they're behind, are they behind, or are we not keeping up with where they are? Was kind of always at the forefront of my mind. Where how can a whole world of children be behind something, or a whole nation of children be behind? If they're all behind, then maybe it's not them. Maybe it's us that are not shifting. And I went into a new school in a new district. And to be frank, it was like a disaster. I had so many regrets. I had so many regrets about moving. I had so many regrets about shifting. And I was like, I was the most unsupported I had ever been. And I largely think it was because everyone was drained. So
Mm.
everyone was just trying to pass the buck. An issue arises, pass the baton to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, because we're all so swamped with everything. And at the end of the day, the only person that suffered was a child. And of course, the other children around them. And as a classroom teacher, I kind of felt helpless because I'm pulling out every tool that I have, but there's not enough resources and there's not enough me to go around. And that's when I was like, you know what? I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know where I'm going to go, but I just know that I'm not going to continue to do this.
So then what happened?
When I literally was driving home, I kid you not, I was driving home and I pulled up to get my daughter from after school, and I'm just sitting there, and my head is pounding from the day because it was just like a disastrous day. And I open my email and I see this. I had never heard of Kai Pi a day in my life. And I just opened my email. They're like, "Do you want to start your own school?" And I deleted it. But when I went home, something said, go through your trash. And I just opened it back up and I read the email and I was like, oh my gosh, like the deadline is like now. So I applied and I was like, they're not going to call me like that. They're not going to call me. I'm going to forget about it. And they called me the next day. And I got set up for the interview. And same thing happened with the interview day. I had to pull into a grocery store parking lot because I was on my way home from the most disastrous day at work. I had to ride the bus home with the kid because he refused to ride the bus with his bus driver. So I had to ride the bus with him, and then I had to get someone to pick me up from his house to get back to my car. And I was like, I'm gonna miss this interview and tank it. And I got on there and I did the best that I could. And then I got that email like you're accepted into the cohort. And I said, okay, this must be fate, like how is it that I would come across this so suddenly? You must be giving me signs. It's time for me to go ahead and do what I need to do. Because of course you go from irregardless to it being a stressful situation, you're getting a steady paycheck, and so you have that anticipated income to stepping out on faith. And I was just like, okay, I guess I'm gonna do this. I guess I'm just gonna go ahead and do it. And I started that cohort, and that's kind of just where I was like, okay, I'm gonna push myself.
Amazing. So, just some background information for listeners and viewers who might not be aware. Kai Pod and Kai Pod Catalyst are what we're talking about here. Kai Pod is a national network of microschools, but they have this highly successful microschool accelerator program for independent microschool founders like you, who just want to kind of gain the insight, information, encouragement, support to launch a microschool or a hybrid homeschool program or similar learning model. And it's a cohort style program over several weeks where you kind of learn the ins and outs of entrepreneurship and work towards creating your business plan and ultimately launching whatever learning environment is meaningful to you. And so when you began participating in the KaiPod Catalyst cohort, what were some of the key the sort of the helpful pieces of it? What was particularly useful for you?
I think what was particularly useful was the fact that I had never heard of a micro school. So in my mind, like when I envision opening a school, and I've thought about it, prior to Kai Pod, but I'm thinking like almost like a daycare, like when we think of starting a school, primarily you think of like a private school or a charter school or some kind of like preschool. But I was like, wow, like this is a way to get a school open with school age children. And there are numerous ways that you can do that. It doesn't just look like kind of like that one size fits all. There are multiple ways in which I could, make this happen for me. So that was really fundamental, and shifting my mindset into like, oh, you can actually do this. Like, this is not going to be like 2, 3, 4 years down the road. Like, this is something that can get started now. And really some of those compliance pieces that I was worried about because I wasn't quite sure like how would that work, but learning about things like the Learning Pod Protection Acts that exist in certain states, really getting myself geared up and getting access to resources for funding because of course I'm a school teacher. It wasn't like I was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So really getting access to different funding resources and really exploring like it doesn't look like I have to have a building to get started. There are numerous ways in which I can utilize space in my home or a church or elsewhere to kind of get myself off the ground. And so that was the biggest help is shifting my mindset into like, oh, like this is something that's tangible. This doesn't have to be 2, 3, 4 years down the road. Like this could be now or it could even be a year from now. It could be a shorter term goal.
Yeah. Yeah, and you opened the Attuned Community School as a hybrid homeschool program in Georgia, sort of under the protection of Georgia's Learning Pod Protection Act that sort of encourages some of these intentionally small, personalized learning communities. And all of the students are registered as homeschoolers. So when you opened in August of 2022, how many students did you start with?
I started with 6 students.
And did you have your children in the program as well, or was
That's my
that?
youngest. My oldest one's in college. So
Oh,
I just
wow.
had my younger one start with us.
She started, he or she started. Okay. And so, and now how many students do you have?
I have 16.
Wow. Just so exciting. So how did you get those initial sort of founding families? Because I think that's
So
often a big hurdle, right?
That is a hurdle. Well, one family, I just started kind of joining like a lot of the homeschool groups and just the mom groups in the area and kind of like casing the area, saying like, hey, is this something you would be interested in? And I hosted things at the park, like popsicles in the park, and different things like that, where I would just show up. I would post in the mom groups like, hey, I'm going to be in the park this day. I'll have a sweet treat for your kid and I'll have some information. Just come and hear me out. And then two of my students from my classroom, when their parents found out that I was resigning, they followed me. They
Wow.
said, well, what are you going to go do? And I said, I'm going to go do this. And they said, well, so are we. And so that's kind of what happened. That's kind of how
Wow.
I got with those
That
students.
must have felt so validating, that the families really treasured you as a teacher so much that they wanted their kids to be wherever you were. So that's so exciting. And how does it work as a hybrid homeschool program? What is the typical weekly schedule like? What is sort of the expectation of families in this environment? How does that all work?
So we are open 5 days, Monday through Friday. I do have children that attend 2 days, 3 days, and 5 days because we do cater to the working homeschool family. And
Hmm.
so for a lot of families, they feel like homeschooling is not possible because they work, but this gives them kind of that option. The expectation for families is that they understand that they are the child's primary educator and that we are here to help and supplement through things like enrichment, tutoring, and social emotional learning. And so they can bring a curriculum or I can provide the curriculum. Lots of them really want me to provide it because some are new homeschool families, or like I said, they work. So it's easier for me to provide it. And what they do is they pick 2 days a week. It's required in our contract that they sit down with their learner and they go through their learning portfolios. They walk through assignments and lessons with them to ensure that they are actively involved. We also require that they attend field trips or certain events that we have here at the school for a minimum amount of 15 hours per year so that they are actively involved in their learners' education. That's the expectations from families, is that we are a community. That's why we have community in our school name. And we are kind of bridging that gap between home and this environment by connecting ourselves in that way.
Mm. Yeah, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your educational philosophy and approach. I know you're very focused on play-based learning, project-based learning, and you have some required reading as families consider whether or not the attuned community school is a good fit for them. You ask them to read two books, The Whole Brain Child by Daniel Siegel, and one of my favorites, Raising Free People, Unschooling as Liberation and Healing Work by Akilah Richards. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about those books and sort of how they tie into the educational approach and environment you're trying to create there.
So I really ask that families read those two books because I want them to know what they're signing up for. I don't want them to walk into this and feel blindsided. I want them to know ahead of time. I want to be completely transparent about what type of environment this is. We definitely focus on project-based learning, or what I'm more shifting towards using is experiential learning because every experience we experience is a part of our learning. And so it's all intertwined and connected. And so we spend a lot of time outdoors. Lots of times we go to forest school, we go to farm school, we go horseback riding. And so those books really tie in because, Akilah talks a lot about freeing children and issues of childism, not just racism, but issues of childism that exist and not understanding that children are children and adults have a lot of issues with power and wanting to control. But children are people, and we're looking to free and liberate them. And they are the masters of their own destinies. We are just guides. We're here to guide them. And it's a privilege to be their guide. I ask that they read Daniel Siegel because I am a firm believer in conscious discipline, or some people like to call it gentle parenting. I call it parenting or trauma informed practices that work with everyone. Being conscious doesn't mean that the children get to do what they want, but really explaining the whys and understanding the whys behind behavior, and that all behavior is communication, and that some things are just a part of development. And so when people are coming into this, I want them to understand that, and I want them to embrace that so that we're on the same page. I do require that my families practice some form or be willing to attend workshops about conscious discipline, because I don't want to discipline one way here and then they're being disciplined another way at home, because it will directly conflict at some point.
Mm.
So it's really important to me that we're all on the same page and understanding not just discipline, but educational philosophies as well.
Mm. And are you finding the families coming to you, are they, had they been homeschooling previously? Had they been in conventional school before joining your program? What's sort of their background?
I have a blend. I have students that I have a few military families. So they're coming from areas where there are lots of micro schools or lots of smaller schools, or they've homeschooled. And then I also have some families that have the foundational belief that they knew no matter what that they were going to go into something like this.
Hmm.
So their kids have never been in a traditional school. But then I have older kids who have been in traditional settings, and it didn't kind of work out for them. And so they shifted into something like this. So I have a blend of families.
And for the families that are coming maybe from a more traditional schooling background, what are some of their reactions to this more innovative, child-centered environment? What do you hear from parents and caregivers?
So for a lot of them, it's a lot of unlearning at first, and really understanding that there is no right or wrong way to learn, and that there is no idea of being behind or being ahead. We are all exactly where we need to be in that moment. And the goal is always to support each learner to focus on their strengths and to build their weaknesses. A lot of them are definitely pleased, but we do a lot of unlearning in the beginning because they're used to grades and they're used to homework and different things like that that we do not follow. We focus on mastery-based learning.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that for folks listening who may not be aware what mastery-based learning is, and how does that sort of showcase improvement and growth?
Absolutely. So mastery-based learning is exactly what it sounds like. There are a set of skills that learners set their goals at the beginning of the year, and we also help them set their goals by looking at different data or different work that they've completed and saying, hey, I notice, this is an area of growth. What kind of goal would you like to set around that, and helping them set those goals? And then they focus on growing that area through the course of a year. And as we notice they are consistently meeting that, then they get a master grade and they move on to the next skill.
So great. And so what has been your reaction now as an education entrepreneur, as a founder, compared to your experience as a classroom teacher? What is it like for you now?
I think I'm still often in shock when people are like, I have a really long wait list right now. So sometimes I'm like, wow, I have a wait list. Or, when I had open house, I had over 40 families show up, and I was like, wow, I never anticipated that. So I'm still working through my own like imposter syndrome, like, you deserve this, you've done this, you've done the hard work, people are hearing about micro schools, people are learning, and you're kind of a part of that. It has been a fundamental shift for me too, shifting from that more traditional model. Because in the beginning, I'm like, am I doing enough? Are they learning enough? And they've learned and they have done so many things. We have been so many places and we have shared in so many experiences. So that took a while to shift, and I'm kind of really really settling into that now, and really embracing that, and it's been very exciting.
Well, just amazing that you have this long wait list. Clearly, there is a huge demand for what it is that you're offering, and that's validation again of the model and of its quality and effectiveness. The fact that more families want in. So, what does the sort of future hold? Do you have plans to expand? Do you think about other ways to accommodate these families on the waiting list? I guess what's next for you?
We are definitely looking to expand. I definitely want to keep them small because I know that my learners and the families that I serve, they thrive in a smaller setting. So it is my goal to expand, to open like another site with another small setting. And I am also hoping to teach other people in my area, whether it's providing them resources to, ways that they can too join this micro school movement or creating community amongst ourselves, because we're kind of like, we're in a weird space. Like we're in middle Georgia. So like it's not quite super rural, but it's also not very city-like. And so it's kind of like a suburban sprawl because everything's kind of spread out. So I'm really looking to bring that community together so that people are educated about these alternatives. That's number one. And so that people can know that other things exist out there and that they can make the connection and build their own, or we can join together with models that exist that don't even know that they're a micro school or a hybrid homeschool, and kind of create a community amongst ourselves so that we can serve families and learners.
So great. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the financial model as well. You are, essentially running a small business that, needs to be sort of financially sustainable in order to serve the families that are currently with you and hopefully those waiting in the wings. And you also want to make the program financially accessible to families. I guess, how do you sort of balance those needs?
We're still working on that balance. Right now, we are 100% tuition funded. Um, we started with a small grant, but this year we operated solely off of tuition funds. And I have been very grateful that I haven't had any issues with that model. I've run into some really great people that have done really great things for my school, whether it was bartering services. Um, you have to get creative, especially in the beginning. You have to get creative. You have to understand that no matter how small a school is, it takes lots of money to run any sort of school, big or small. And so getting creative, using your families as resources, asking them, who do they know? What do they know? How can they be of service? Those volunteer services go really, really far, because we've had families do some wonderful things in exchange, things that you might pay for, where you can just kind of barter that service. So getting creative, understanding what funding sources are out there if you decide to be, especially for someone like me, I'm an LLC. So understanding what you have access to as far as grants or different models when you are an LLC versus a nonprofit. So we rely primarily on our tuition, and then we look at other ways to build income, whether it's fundraising, whether it's doing things like offering coaching sessions or different things to kind of build that sustainable income within the umbrella of services that is offered.
And what do you think, Latoya, has been one of the biggest challenges to starting a biker school like yours?
I think the biggest challenge, I would say, I would say all of it. But the biggest hurdle that many face, including myself, is that initial startup cost. And
Mm,
then that kind of like sometimes when you're starting a business, you can isolate yourself. So really building your community, that's why stuff like HiPod and all those things are really great because you can build a community, for yourself so that you are not working in isolation and working alone, because you have to be super intentional because you don't want to burn out. You don't want to give up. So having that community, people you can bounce ideas off of, people that you can say, hey, I hit this wall. Do you have any resources? Do you know anyone that I can get in touch with? Having access to that can be crucial, especially in those first couple of years when they're just going to be naturally hard. It's a new
yeah.
business.
Yeah. And what about the biggest reward that you found in being an entrepreneur?
Freedom. Freedom. Uh, It it's freeing. It's freeing to be able to have time freedom, being able to create a schedule that works not just for my families, but that works for me as well. That's freeing. Also, freedom to teach in ways that I know that works for each individual learner. Freedom to get outdoors with the kiddos as much as possible. Freedom to say, this is not working today. Let's try again, tomorrow. Freedom. That's been the largest reward.
Oh, I love, 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 love that. So, if other parents and teachers are listening and they're looking for that freedom as well, and they want to give entrepreneurship a go, what advice do you have for those listening and watching who may be interested in launching a hybrid homeschool, a microschool, or similar learning model?
I would say just go for it. Don't overthink, because I think naturally, especially if you're a parent or an educator, I think we naturally just overthink things because of the roles that we're in. We've always got to think of the what ifs and have a plan B and a plan C. I would say don't overthink it. You've already got the skills. You know exactly what children need. And even if you don't know, you have the capability to learn it. And so just go for it. Just go
Right.
for it. Nothing beats a failure but a try.
Love it. So, Latoya, if folks want to contact you, follow your progress, learn more about your program, what is the best way for them to do that?
The best way to learn more about the program is on our Facebook, the Attune Community School. The school is most active there. I am also on Instagram as the Attune Community School, and you can also find some of my other work around conscious discipline and education in the classroom on raising underscore resilience on Instagram.
Terrific. And the website as well is theattunedcommunityschool.org. So excited to see your progress, hoping that more and more families get off that wait list as you continue to grow and provide more services to families in your community. Latoya Nelson, thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
No problem. Thank you for having me.